welcome once again to Why Should We Care About the Indo-Pacific, brought to you by IEJ Media and our sponsor, Bauer Group Asia. More on them later. I'm Ray Powell in California. That's Jim Caruso in Arizona. Jim, one of our most popular topics to talk about has been Australia, United Kingdom, U.S. agreement called AUKUS. And especially its plan to build submarines, especially there for Australia. So we've talked to Australian and American military officers, politicians, other experts, and some are very optimistic and some are extremely skeptical. Jim, we have a very special guest with us today, I understand.
Indeed we do. We are so pleased to have Connecticut's very own congressman from the 2nd District, beautiful 2nd District of Connecticut, Congressman Joe Courtney. In his district is Groton, Connecticut, home of Electric Boat, which builds a whole lot of subs. Congressman, welcome to our podcast. Thanks for joining us.
No, thank you for the invitation. I love the opportunity to, talk through this issue with as wide a group as we can.
Ray and I have been dealing with Australia for a long time. AUKUS is near and dear to our heart, but there are always bumps on the road. You've been instrumental in getting it over the line, but there's still a lot of concern. So maybe we could start with our first question. Why should we care about whether Australia gets these subs?
So, as somebody who not only serves on the Armed Services Committee and ranking on sea power, very close to the shipbuilding enterprise in the Navy for subs and other platforms, I also have been co-chairs of the Friends of Australia caucus going back to 2017, and actually when AUKUS was announced in 2021, a bipartisan group of members formed the AUKUS working group. And I think that, having been over there a number of times and, pre-AUKUS, where there's no question that, the country recognizes that their fleet of Collins-class submarines are aging out, and the need to recapitalize their undersea fleet is not really it's a mandatory question. Obviously, being an island nation and certainly having an experienced history of operating submarines with their own navy. So the question for them, which again I heard about pre-AUKUS, was whether or not this massive investment, regardless of which platform you take, whether it would be a diesel electric or whether it would be nuclear powered submarine, was going to be a massive cost no matter how you slice it. And as you both know, I'm sure, they made the decision to go to diesel electric, and France stepped forward. And again, the price tag on that, which was large to begin with, over time was starting to really increase. And again, in my trips and talking to government ministers and think tank folks, there was definitely concerns and skepticism about the decision that they made. And, in the midst of all of this time period, the security environment was just dramatically changing in the Indo-Pacific. And I think, the question of which choice to make sort of resurfaced, given the fact that they understood, and I think most countries or navies understand in that part of the world, that particularly China's development of missile technologies has made, really surface Navy ships, warships, much, much more vulnerable. And that pertains to diesel electrics, because no matter how, far advanced some of the technology has gotten, and it has advanced, there's no question about it, they still have to surface. And, again, my district, which, still has some World War II and diesel electric submarine veterans, they always sort of characterize it, that those subs were actually surface ships that occasionally would submerge. And so I honestly, I do think that, that whole question of the vulnerability caused by China's, huge investment in missile technology, weighed heavily on Australian decision makers. And then, in September of 2021, when the decision was announced to create this new security agreement and to shift their investment and decision into nuclear-powered submarines, really that was, I think, very much a sovereign decision of the leadership of that country, and it was driven, as I said, by the fact that they realized that the reach of their submarines and the stealth of their submarines, given what's happening in the security environment, and that they're going to have to spend a lot of money, really almost regardless of what choice they make. It made sense to basically go the pathway they chose. And obviously, when the optimal pathway was announced in March of 2023, which sort of laid out the purchase of a minimum of 3 subs and maybe 5 from the U.S. while they're developing their own submarine industrial base, is something that, again, got tremendous scrutiny from the U.S. Navy, the Office of Naval Reactors, Hyman Rickover's, institution that he created. I mean, they scrubbed this thing really hard, and I think they made the decision that even with all the challenges in submarine construction, that this was a decision that the U.S. could handle.
So I'm going to go ahead and push on that a little, Congressman. So that's probably, of all of the concerns that have been brought up throughout all of our interviews, probably none more stark than that brought up by former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, who basically just doesn't believe it. He does not believe the U.S. is going to be able to meet this commitment. He looks out at our defense industrial base and how we're churning out submarines, and specifically the Virginia-class submarines, which are the ones that we're supposed to be delivering, and says the U.S. is just going to come to a point where we're going to say, sorry, we just don't have enough submarines. So, and there's an out in the agreement. If we can't meet the requirements, then we're just not going to give them the subs. What do you say to that?
So, I mean, it's a legitimate question and concern, and I was involved in the drafting of the language in the 2024 NDAA, which again has a requirement that the President of the United States has to certify that the sale of these subs, again, the first one is in 2032, second in 2035, third in 2038, which I think is important also for people to note when this conversation is happening. But again, the president has to certify that it's not going to be to the detriment of our own Navy and our own undersea fleet. When that language was being written, there was some who wanted to be even more prescriptive in terms of that decision that is called for in the law, to basically require that we couldn't sell a submarine unless we reached the Navy's shipbuilding plan, which I think, as you guys know, is to really right now in terms of the demand for submarine deployments is probably over 60 Virginia class attack submarines. Today we're roughly at around 51 if you include the 3 Seawolf attack submarines and add them to the fleet of Los Angeles and Virginia class subs that are still in operation today. But I would just say this. I mean, in our very pointed questioning of the Navy leadership, both Admiral Caldwell, who was the head of naval reactors when the deal was negotiated, as well as his successor, Admiral Houston, these guys follow in the Rickover tradition. They jealously protect and guard nuclear propulsion technology and the fleet. And I cannot really understate or overstate, just how adamant they were that this is something we can handle. That particularly again when you look at those dates, when we're talking really 8 years, 7.5 years, but before the first submarine would be sold, and also given the fact that Congress has really stepped up its game, not just in terms of funding contracts for submarine construction, but also direct investment in terms of the industrial base, which is quite unique. And And, I mean, I would just say that, right now, so far, there's been over $6 billion that the U.S. has invested in the submarine industrial base. The continuing resolution and supplemental that we just passed at the end of December increased that amount more. And then right now, the projection is that there's going to be probably $3 to $4 billion new money in the 26 budget when it comes over later this year. That money goes to workforce, supply chain, and facility. And it is definitely happening in real time as we're talking, in terms of the strategic outsourcing. Austell Shipyard in Alabama is now doing steel fabrication to take some of the load off of that work that now happens up at Quonset Point, Rhode Island, and the Newport News. There's Philly Shipyard is now going to also become a strategic supply chain company to, again, take some of this work that's not highly classified, but obviously essential in terms of getting the modular units picked up. So I'm very bullish on the fact that we're gonna definitely overcome the slowdown that COVID contributed to. I am, again, representing Groton. I can just attest to the fact that the retirements of metal trades workers accelerated during COVID, and they're doing quite well in terms of recruitment and retention of Gen Zers. But I mean, you guys both know you don't replace a 30-year master welder, with a semi-skilled new hire who's very enthusiastic and getting involved in the work. So that obviously has the change in the demographic of the shipyard is just really striking. And,
so what you're saying is
take a while.
The current 1.2 subs per year build rate, we need at least 2.2 is what I understand.
Right.
So you're thinking we can meet that on the current glide path?
I do. And again, I have a chart which I have behind me here, which I think is very instructive. And it's basically, it uses a different metric than the actual submarine delivery, which is the 1.2, and instead is based on tonnage, okay, which is a legitimate metric, in my opinion, when you're talking about ship construction. And this is a chart which shows tonnage going back to 1952 up to the present and into the 2030s at Electric Boat, which in the submarine industrial base. And for people listening without the video, again, it's kind of a sawtoothed chart that shows, again, spikes that took place after World War II, when we had the first ballistic submarines getting built simultaneous with attack submarines, and then particularly from like about 1976 to 1994. I mean, you can see when we were building simultaneously Los Angeles class attack subs and the Ohio class attack subs. I mean, the tonnage definitely spiked up significantly. And again, they were delivering more than, some years it was even 3 or 4 Los Angeles class subs at the same time that they were building the Ohio subs. So now, moving forward, I think, maybe I can scooch back here. This is the peace dividend, that dip that took place. I mean, and again, EB back in the early 1990s probably had close to 28,000 workers, and it dropped when I first got elected to Congress. It was down about 7,000. I mean, it was a dramatic shift.
So this is the so-called peace dividend that the United States, after the Cold War, decided that the world was a safer place and that we could sort of we could take our foot off the gas as far as defense production and the military and concentrate more on economic and other issues.
Correct. And I mean, it's a very steep decline. I mean, the yard actually came close to closing, and it was the Seawolf program, which Senator Inouye, stepped in and saved the yard literally by, having the 3 subs, the Seawolf, Connecticut, and Jimmy Carter, built, which kind of kept the lights on in the shipyard there. And then slowly, we started to get back on track, or at least in terms of tonnage, with the Virginia program when we went to 2 Virginias back in 2011. that's when you can start to see the tonnage growth that's happening. And again, now we're similar to the Cold War era. We're building two classes of submarines simultaneously. The Columbia class subs, which are about 21,000 tons. A Virginia sub is 7,800 tons. There's going to be a block of Virginia subs that are going to be a little heavier. They're going to be about 10,000 tons with the payload module extension that's in it. So anyway, I mean, between COVID and the fact that Columbia is online, in my opinion, spending a lot of time with the people down at the yard, that's what really I think is driving that 1.2, 1.3 delivery. But the trajectory of tonnage is very positive. And with the submarine industrial base funding that Congress is putting in, I mean, that's how we get this to go even higher.
I guess what I don't understand is, all right, the tonnage, especially for the ballistic missiles, that's a lot of tonnage.
Yes.
We're just talking about numbers of subs and whether the U.S. Navy has enough subs to send some to Australia. That seems to be the question.
So if you asked Admiral Houston that question, as he was asked in public at the Sea Power subcommittee, his answer would be twofold. There's no question that there's more demand than subs available, for the different combatant commands, around the world right now. But I mean, there's never, I mean, you ask combatant commanders, do you want more? They always say yes. Okay. So, they have to, obviously adjust for the fact that, that's just a reality that's never really going to change. But a bigger concern for Houston and the Navy right now is that the repair and maintenance side of the equation, which again, ideally 80% of the fleet should be available for deployment. When Admiral Houston took over, which again was right sort of, at the peak, maybe just past the peak of COVID, the number had dropped to 60%, which is totally unacceptable. And he has been very focused in terms of trying to make sure that, that changes. It's up to about 68% right now. We're the public yards, who also took a hit during COVID, are now sort of getting back on track. I think you probably know Congress is finally, belatedly funding expansion and upgrade of the public shipyards. I was up in Portsmouth last August, where again, it's called the SIOP, the Shipyard Improvement and Optimization Program. But they're doubling the dry dock space at Portsmouth, which is a ancient shipyard that's happening out in Honolulu and Hawaii right now, and Washington State and San Diego are slated to also get their public yards upgraded and modernized, and that's going to help get the fleet back to a readiness number, which again I think is a big part of this question being answered confidently. And again, I think if you look at just last year, we had the USS New Jersey delivered in December, end of December. US Iowa was delivered. This year, Massachusetts is slated for full commissioning, and the Idaho are going to be delivered. So again, they're late. I don't want to sugarcoat this too much, but the fact of the matter is, you can start to see that the production is recovering.
Can I ask you about that, Congressman? So earlier last year, there was some controversy over whether or not 2 Virginia-class subs were going to be built this year.
Right.
And so you have said that there will be 2. What happened? I mean, what is the state of the discussion? Does everybody now accept that there will be 2, or is it still a matter of controversy? And what has happened between that initial assessment that said there would only be 1 by the Navy and now?
So I think, first of all, the backdrop is there is consensus on the fact that there is desire for for us to keep the production and funding levels at that level of 2 per year, Virginia, and full funding for Columbia. And as I said, those subs I just sort of rattled off there. I mean, if in full disclosure, I mean, if you go back and look at what the delivery dates were supposed to be for those subs pre-COVID, they're late. I mean, there's just no question that that's not a totally accurate picture if you're trying to make the case that we've recovered. I mean, we've still got work to do, to get the cadence, which is really, as I think Jim said, was like 2.2 or 2.3 for AUKUS's purposes. And so anyway, the Navy's projection right now is that by 2028, with the SIB investments, the submarine industrial base investments, that, we really should be back to a 2.0 Virginia cadence. And Columbia, the first Columbia submarine is late. Also, right now, the U.S. has District of Columbia. We had a conference in Groton just the other day, and the new CEO said that, the problem with District of Columbia is that the bow is late from Newport News, and the turbine generator, which is being built by Northrop Grumman, is also late. It's first in class, not totally surprised, that there's going to be some glitches that are there. But, the Wisconsin is right behind it, which is the second Columbia boat that's there. And, the last thing I would just say is that, there was definitely lots of negotiation going on at the end of the Biden administration about the fact that the funding mechanism kind of some ways aggravates the funding system that we have, which is annual appropriations, where money is sort of locked up for a specific platform after it's been, appropriated. That kind of is hindering them, particularly Newport News, from sort of recovering faster as far as the work that's down there. And there's a proposal that the Navy developed called SAWS. You may have seen some reporting in the defense press about it, but it would create more flexibility in terms of moving some funds forward that, again, would get at particularly some of the workforce issues that are there. My prediction is that the Trump administration is going to adopt that. And it doesn't require new money to be appropriated by Congress. It just sort of gives the Navy and the shipyards some more flexibility to, really get after where some of the delays are. And supply chain, in my opinion, is more of an acute problem than workforce. I mean, I think that, I've talked about the drop from 28,000 to 7,000 that took place at the end of the Cold War. Supply chain was at about 15,000 supply chain companies around the U.S. And today it's less than 4,000. So you have a lot of components and parts of the construction process where you basically have only one supplier, which is a very fragile, brittle state of affairs that's there. And that's why delays can just, kind of hit you out of nowhere when one sole supplier can suddenly, Northrop Grumman is a little bit more of a unique, because it's such a large product or component with turbine generator, but still when it's late, and that's holding back completion.
So we know how new administration from the time AUKUS was inaugurated. Have you heard what the view of the new administration is about AUKUS? As we speak in early February, the Australian Defence and Deputy Prime Minister Richard Marles will be here any day, I think, to seek assurance about where this is going. What are you hearing?
So, having been through the, congressional process in 2023, and even last year, there was some AUKUS provisions in last year's NDAA. The bipartisan support is quite extraordinary. And and I realize, obviously we're dealing with an administration where the president, really has a very, strong influence on everything, that sort of gets approved there. But the fact that, Marco Rubio is, now confirmed Secretary of State, he voted for all the AUKUS provisions. He has, publicly, vocally, stated that he's a strong supporter of AUKUS. Mike Waltz, the national security advisor, served on armed services with me, and he wasn't on Sea Power, but he was on Readiness committee and got, really, I think, really, brought up to speed in terms of the readiness issues for the Navy. And so he also has publicly expressed strong support for AUKUS. And that to me bodes well, if that you've got really two very close advisors. The AUKUS legislation that we passed, in some ways was more of a State Department bill than it was a DOD bill, just because, all of the foreign military sales issues, the, export control issues under ITAR, some of the issues regarding workforce as far as getting Australian foreign nationals approved to go into classified areas and shipyards. Today, they're prohibited from going into, all that stuff, involved the foreign affairs committees, both in the House and the Senate. And Rubio, of course, was on the Senate committee. So, anyway, I think that, that bodes well. And, unlike almost everything that this administration complains about with tariffs and, other countries using the U.S., Australia is a net importer from the U.S., and they are paying top dollar for these Virginia-class submarines. These are not giveaways. And Australia is also ponying up $3 billion of its own money to invest in the U.S. industrial base, which is unheard of, that another country has actually done that. And I know that because that one was also included in the AUKUS authorities. We had to pass a law to create a mechanism at the Treasury Department to accept money from another country that to be invested, through the Navy into industrial base. So, they clearly check all the boxes in terms of, trade issues, who's paying issues, so that I'm bullish on the fact that AUKUS is going to survive this transition.
So, Congressman, you talked a little bit about the structural weaknesses in the U.S. industrial base, and we've heard this number thrown around about shipbuilding, that China can basically build over 200 or 220 times the number of ships that we can build. So this seems like the kind of thing that, one, is potentially an existential kind of problem, but two, the kind of thing that, as you say, there ought to be wide bipartisan support for addressing, especially in the current climate where we're concerned about the U.S. industrial base writ large. We're concerned about manufacturing. We're concerned about American jobs. We're concerned about bringing work home and jobs home and all of these things. Is what has been done so far, is it enough? Or does more need to be done, and what's going to be done?
Sure. So, I wrote a piece for one of the news outlets here in DC. The title of it is it's about the industrial base, stupid. Because really, there's anywhere you look, munitions, aerospace, shipbuilding. It's the same refrain that's out there. And again, that decline of the American workforce in manufacturing, which is sort of, in my opinion, the real story that people need to get their heads around. Matt Sermon over the Department of Navy often quotes an amazing statistic, which at the end of the Cold War, when that chart shows the drop off, that the U.S. workforce, 35% was in manufacturing, and today it's less than 15%. It's kind of a shocking number sometimes when you sort of see it that side by side difference that's there. And so that's why, again, I think, as subs have now just risen to the top of the food chain in terms of priority, that suddenly the Navy's in the business of investing in programs for metal trades, education and career and technical schools, and apprenticeship programs, et cetera. And so, I do think that, and there's also a shift that's happening, in my opinion. Again, I sit on the education committee as well, but you're seeing a shift in terms of not just trade school growth, which is happening, but also non-trade secondary schools are now getting into what's called career pathway programs. And I've been cutting ribbons at some of the, again, traditional high schools for new welding labs in Connecticut, which are very popular, and kids are really moving towards it. And actually, it's increased school attendance, which is kind of a nice sort of side benefit of giving kids more opportunities to learn trades and professions in this area. But it's something that we really have to stay very focused on. I mean, frankly, the president's proposal to abolish the U.S. Department of Education, that is really actually the agency that funds what's called Perkins grants, that funds career and technical education. And I actually was at a meeting today raising that point, is that I agree. I personally think that education is a national priority. We can't sort of view it as something that's just going to take care of it by itself at the state and local level. We really need to have, and Hyman Rickover, by the way, at the end of his life, wrote a lot about that our competitors are investing and prioritizing education, and we need to as well. Obviously, that's a much more sort of broad, take on your question that's there. But, as I say, I was at a conference the other day with the Navy. Getting funding for shipbuilding has really not been a problem with Congress. I mean, we have plussed up shipbuilding budgets going back really to 2010 every year. And so it's really, that how do we get our heads around that issue of execution, of the contracts and the funding. And it as I said, it just sort of goes back to the industrial base. One last point I would make is that, yes, China is, got tremendous capacity, and the size of their Navy is growing. I think it's important to remember, though, when we talk about nuclear-powered attack submarines, they have 6 of them. That's it. Okay. I mean, their fleet is almost predominantly diesel electrics, which are not anything to poo-poo. But the fact is that, they have also struggled, with their own nuclear-powered attack submarine program. The Wall Street Journal had a satellite photo last summer of the new Zhao class attack submarine, which was at the bottom of the Yangtze River. It sank. Pier side.
It's supposed to be underwater, so that makes sense.
Yeah, but they had all the dredging ships and recovery ships surrounding the spot that was there. So, look at this is tough stuff. Building these subs. I mean, right? It operates in an environment that doesn't support human life. It's nuclear powered. It's armed. I mean, this is a very complex enterprise.
But speaking how complex this is, and supply chain of 4,000 companies who have their own supply chains. It's an amazing multidimensional Rubik's Cube. Has anyone looked at how much of the inputs come from China?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the submarine program, if you look at the sort of Buy America legal, restrictions that are there, I think is pretty clean, in terms of China. It's not 100% clean in terms of other countries, that we import. Just a few days ago, when everyone was focused on Canadian tariffs, one of the key elements in submarine construction is in nickel, which goes into the steel alloy for a lot of the different parts of a submarine. And, Canada is our biggest supplier of nickel. And, putting a 25% tariff on that and is just, totally, ridiculous. That's there. But
that news is just so 48 hours ago.
Yeah, I know. Exactly. But hey, it was a 30-day, reprieve. So who knows? But I And by the way, AUKUS, one of the benefits of AUKUS, aside from Pillar 1 on submarines, I mean, the Pillar 2 part, which is, critical technologies. But we also passed a provision in the NDAA that included Australia as a quote unquote domestic source under the Defense Production Act. So they're not the 51st state, but they are eligible for DoD Defense Production Act investments. And I can just tell you that, based on my conversations with the DoD leadership, investment in critical mineral, processing in Australia, who is, a country loaded with, everything in terms of critical minerals is something that I think is going to be another benefit of AUKUS.
Well, Congressman, I'm trying to satisfy myself that where we are in our politics is sufficiently serious about this issue and the accompanying issues that we're going to be able to. So, all of the things that you mentioned about the plan and what we had planned to do before, and then COVID came, and then this happened. This is what in the military profession we would call friction, right? These are the things that just happen, that no plan survives first contact with the enemy or with just stuff. The bureaucracy, the law, all the COVID, all of the things that happen along the way to slow things down. And as we are looking out, and we've had discussions about whether or not Taiwan is ready to sort of erupt, whether we've got we've talked before about the Davidson window, which is 2027, and all of these things are happening we're talking about very, very soon. Do you sense that there is sufficient seriousness about this as an issue when, of course, we are concentrated right now very heavily on immigration and DEI and other things that are sort of top of the news, the work of the Doge, the Elon Musk? Are we focused enough on national security, defense industrial base, and the production of submarines?
So, I can tell you this, that looking back at 2023 and 2024, when we enacted the AUKUS authorities, just to sort of, I think, frame it in terms of the seriousness of Congress, as far as the challenges that AUKUS is designed to counter. When the three countries unveiled the optimal pathway in March of 2023, again, I think you guys know, for 18 months, AUKUS had been totally sort of off the radar screen because all the negotiations were taking place privately. So March is when the optimal pathway was announced. Department of Defense sent over to Congress the different authorities that, the optimal pathway would require. Again, we talked about them earlier in terms of sale of the subs and defense export controls and ITAR and all that stuff. So that came over roughly in probably the beginning of June. And by December, the entire package had sort of made its way through multiple committees, because it didn't all go through armed services. It had to go through, foreign affairs, financial services, the HASC and SASC committees and bicameral. And we got it to Biden's desk, and it was signed into law by right around Christmas in 2023. If you go back in history and look at the process that UK had to go through to get nuclear technology after World War II, there's a book written about how long it took. The title is called The Long Wait. And it's by a British historian, Timothy Boddy. And it talks about how, after the war and FDR had died, Churchill reached out to Truman and the government saying, hey, we helped foot the bill for the Manhattan Project. And I had a commitment from FDR that, we would be given access, to that technology. In the meantime, Congress had passed the McMahon Act after Hiroshima. Actually, Brian McMahon was a senator from the state of Connecticut that basically prohibited sharing of nuclear technology with anyone, including our strongest ally in World War II. It took until 1958 for Congress to finally sort of relent and allow the nuclear technology to be shared with the UK. The book, describes Hyman Rickover, who was, hard at work with, the Nautilus and the follow-on submarines to Nautilus at the time. He was pretty annoyed, that they had to do that, but he basically just packaged up a reactor and just sent it over to their shipyards because they were really struggling at the time in terms of the development of their own nuclear-powered fleet. But again, it took 13 years for Congress to finally grudgingly share that technology. And in the case of AUKUS, we did it in less than 6 months. And to me, that's Congress obviously does, for a lot of people, it's always frustrating. It's too slow. It doesn't, sort of react fast enough. But, that was something that, was extremely bipartisan, and everybody got it that, this is a race we're in right now in terms of the Indo-Pacific region, and we had to move out and get it through.
Now, as a former State Department guy, I used to deal with the Paul Mill people. Getting those changes to our U.S. export laws and how they work is a miracle.
It really is. Yeah, I mean, Bob. I remember Robert Gates. That was like a big project for him to reform ITAR, and he basically threw up his hands after about 3 or 4 years. Between the State Department and Congress, he just
Yes, Ray and I had fewer gray hairs before we had to deal with this sort of issue. But
I still have fewer, by the way.
Yeah, but you have less hair. But now, again, as former Prime Minister Turnbull and others keep telling us, they just don't see this happening because the U.S. is under such pressure to deliver for the U.S. Navy first. And I don't think we've done a good job explaining to Australians why it's in the U.S. national interest for Australia to have those subs. So for our Australian guests and friends, why should Australia have these subs from a U.S. point of view?
So, again, the other part of my district is also a submarine base, which is, the home of the submarine school that all submariners go through, from, officers to, new recruits. And one of the things that we did in Congress was authorize joint training of Australian sailors and naval officers, which is happening, as we're talking here right now. I've been to a couple of the graduations from the sub school. And, right now, some of those graduates are on board Virginia-class submarines. There was one at the helm of the USS Hawaii when it arrived in Perth. I think it was last summer or early fall that was there. But again, that was one of those guys that, at the graduation ceremony. And they were, I would just tell you this, the enthusiasm that the Australian, groups that's there, they were outperforming their U.S. counterparts in terms of their scores at sub school. So, but again, I think that with the joint training and the deployment now, and it's going to be a rotational deployment of Virginia-class submarines in and out of Perth, which Australia is now building up infrastructure to accommodate. That presence in the Astute class, I think, is also going to join in from the UK. I would say to my Australian friends, it's just like, this is a win-win. And that's really what the U.S. Navy says, is that, having now, a systemic presence in the Indo-Pacific, particularly facing the Indian Ocean, which Perth does, but, also the proximity to South China Sea, I think really is an advantage that kind of, to use a bad term, trumps the prime minister's concerns that are there. I mean, on paper, it looks like, this AUKUS is going to delay the U.S. Navy to get to 66 attack submarines. But frankly, shipbuilding plans that the Navy sends over that, Turnbull and others are looking at, a lot of times they're just aspirational, honestly, in terms of not just subs, but other classes of submarines. You really have to, I think, go a little deeper in terms of, assessing the value of AUKUS, which, as I said, the Navy leadership has been just, 100% unanimous in terms of supporting and don't feel that the risk of selling 3 subs, the third one won't be for, another 13 years from now, is really any reason not to keep going forward.
Well, Congressman Joe Courtney, this has been illuminating. It has been encouraging because Jim and I think, are both pretty invested in the outcomes that you're working towards. So we are rooting for this. We do hope that you have continued success in pushing this forward. And we want to give you one last chance to tell our listeners where they can follow along with this if they're interested in what else you have to say about this.
Sure. Well, again, I talked a lot about what we did in 2023. I mean, there was also armed services provisions in last year's NDAA that were AUKUS related. Again, another, I think, validator of AUKUS is that we had in the bill a requirement that DoD report back to Congress about Japan, sort of getting involved at least with Pillar 2 of AUKUS, because there's no question that country has been expressing strong interest, along with, frankly, New Zealand. I was at the Singapore Shangri-La conference, and the South Korean delegation, was in there. When can we buy subs too? So,
right. Just because I don't think we explained this yet. Pillar 1 being the submarine pillar, Pillar
right.
2 being the advanced technology development.
Correct. Yes, that's right. And so, but there's just no question that in the region, there's people understand immediately, what the value of this is. By the way, at the Shangri-La conference, the Chinese had their own delegation that was there. It was quite interesting, to sort of see their, yeah. Oh, were you there?
I was.
Yeah. I mean, it was, I'm sure that guy had cameras on him, their leadership there. But anyway, I mean, they were obviously trashing AUKUS and, really misrepresenting, lots of things about it, but it's clearly gotten under their skin. And I think that's something that the region has noticed that's there. Again, the House Armed Services Committee, Sea Power Subcommittee, which has links and contact information, is certainly a good place for people to sort of track sort of AUKUS related issues. And certainly my office, which, we can send you the links. We track it all the time. CSIS, the think tank has an Australian component to it, and Charlie Edel is just doing great work.
And we had him on talking about this exact topic.
Okay, good. Now,
our advertisement, Congressman.
Yeah.
Congressman, we want to thank you. This has been fascinating and really important, and a very good tonic for those of us who wring our hands about it. You've been an outstanding guest, sir, and I hope that we can have you on in the future.
So I really enjoyed it and happy to come back.
All right, Jim, as we mentioned, Congressman Courtney was really optimistic. Of course, he has reason to be really optimistic. He has an awful lot of this issue embedded in his congressional district. Do you feel better about AUKUS than you did when we started?
Well, it's certainly, he's aware of the criticisms coming from Australia. He's aware of the pushback from some members of the Navy and members of Congress, and he seems pretty confident that the Trump administration is going to push through all this and get this done. So, sure, why not? I need some optimism.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so, his chart, which again, our audio listeners can't see, but I mean, it does show a future spike of pretty substantial proportions in overall submarine shipbuilding tonnage. In fact, a bigger spike than we've seen really in history if it comes to pass. So, and that would bode well. Now, of course, that includes a lot of nuclear powered submarines, which are a lot heavier. So, in the end, it does matter how many of these submarines, these Virginia class, which are the kinds that Australia has been promised. And as we talk about Australia's investment, it's not just a monetary investment. And talked about $3 billion. It's not just all the submariners coming over for training and all of the other things that they're doing. It's an opportunity cost, right? Because they had another submarine and they canceled that program, with the one with France, and in order to turn into this. So, it really is very important for the alliance, for overall security, and just frankly for not wasting time doing things that aren't going to come to pass. we really have to do this.
You know, I gave the Congressman an opportunity to talk about why it's in the U.S. interest to have Australia have these submarines as opposed to us.
Yep.
And what I hoped he'd say was that if Australia has these highly capable subs, this will now complicate China's strategic approach because they have to account for these.
Yep.
And that helps us. It also means our effective people at sea in these vehicles is now increased by the size of the Australian submarine force. So huge advantages are considered.
When we talk about an industrial base, you have the U.S. Defense Industrial Base, you have Australia's industrial base, some portion of which will be dedicated to maintaining and operating submarines. And that is, in the overall strategic picture, additive in a very important way that not only can we access that through this agreement, we need actually to evolve that relationship, because we need the help on our own defense industrial base across the board. We are certainly better together as a unit.
Well, once again, Ray, we are in violent agreements, which is just so disappointing. But you have a story to tell us which will illustrate all this.
I will. Well, actually, so what got my attention was when the congressman was talking, he said something that really rang true for me, which is, or at least rang familiar to me, which is Australia is not the 51st state. And of course, we've been having an ongoing joke about whether or not Canada would become the 51st state.
Joke? Okay.
But apparently that may not happen. But I used to use that word, though, that phrase all the time when I would have U.S. military groups come over, delegations come over to Australia, and we'd sit down around that big table in the embassy, and one of the things I'd say is, please remember that Australia is not the 51st state, which meant that just because all of their military officers tend to be in almost 100% agreement when they look at the strategic problem, when they look at priorities, when we look at all of these things, all the military folks see the world this very close to being the same way. But politically, we are two very different countries, and they have different national concerns. They have different politics. They're going to have, right now they have a labor government in charge, where we have which is the more left-leaning government, where we have a right-leaning government. We have different, our sine waves go in different directions, and so not everything that we say is going to be agreed to by every Australian when we say it. But on the military side, because we have been together through thick and thin, through wars in the Middle East and Afghanistan and all these things, we've got this long history, 100 years of mateship, all of these things. A lot of people on the military side tended to think that we just had it all going up and down the political landscape. And even at the sort of very, very basic level, I remember, there are still things, and he also made reference to this, there are still things that we don't share, not because we don't want to, but because our structures just aren't optimized to share it. So we have things that are, we label them, classify them what we call no foreign. No foreigners allowed to see this, right? And that makes sense, right? You'll want things that are only U.S. eyes. And then we have another classification, which is Five Eye, for the five countries, U.S., Canada, U.K., New Zealand, and Australia, who are supposed to share things across the board. And the general assumption is that most things are going to be Five Eye. But having worked in the bureaucracy, there's so much stuff that we produce. A lot of stuff just gets classified no foreign just because it's easier. I'm less likely to get in trouble as an American classifying something no foreign that doesn't get released than if I accidentally classify something Five Eye and it shouldn't have got released. So I just sort of reflexively reach for the no foreign button, and this would drive the Aussies nuts.
Well, it actually would also drive nuts the senior military American commanders, because they kept saying we need to share information.
I had this exact conversation with the commander of Strategic Command during a visit from the vice chief of the Australian Defense Force, and they said the same thing, where you guys are putting no foreign all over everything. And the senior military, this 4-star, was saying, I don't get it. I have told my people over and over and over, we're classifying things Five Eye. And I actually sat there as like the one, the sort of the lowest ranking person at the table as a colonel. And I said, sir, frankly, people like me are part of your problem. We are in the bureaucracy and we are reflexively doing the thing that is least likely to get us in trouble.
Right. So I believe there was one senior Air Force officer, commander, who said, if you want to classify something no foreign, you need a general officer to approve it.
Yeah, I'd say that person was the exception and not the rule.
Yes.
So, but anyway, it gives you the idea of how actually transformational AUKUS can be in other ways besides just, submarines. So, all right. Well, Jim, we have gone long, so I'm going to go ahead and thank you and thank our producer, Ian Ellis Jones, and his company, IEJ Media, which is the company that puts our podcast into the public space. I also, of course, urge our listeners to follow him on X at Ian Ellis Jones. I keep seeing his stuff popping up at the most interesting places. And if you like this episode, of course, we have a lot more of them. I would specifically point out episode 20 with retired Australian Navy Commander Jennifer Parker, when we talked about why should we care about the AUKUS submarine, where she made that from an Australian perspective. You can get us on audio in Apple Podcasts and Spotify. You can follow us on X at Indo-Pac Podcast or on LinkedIn. Just look for the name of this podcast. Finally, you can email us, indopacificpodcast@gmail.com. By the way, I promised you that I would tell you about Bauer Group Asia, our great sponsor. They are a strategic advisory firm that specializes in the Indo-Pacific. Bauer Group applies unmatched expertise and experience to help clients navigate the world's most complex and dynamic markets. Jim Caruso is a senior advisor with Bauer Group, and you can reach them at their website, BauerGroupAsia.com. Please do that. And when you talk to somebody at Bauer Group, make sure you tell them that we sent you there because they are helping us give this to the world. For Jim and Ian, I'm Ray. We'll see you next time on Why Should We Care About the Indo-Pacific?